Home was supposed to be the one border no enemy could cross. Arabella had believed that the way children believe in sunrise, not because anyone proved it, but because life collapsed without it. Yet exile had arrived wearing familiar voices, familiar hands, familiar laws recited over her as if betrayal could become clean when spoken by elders. Grief had already hollowed her out, blood loss had left her trembling, and still, the deepest wound came last. Not the masked men who murdered her mate in the dark, but the pack that waited for her to sleep and sold her body, her name, and her unborn child before dawn. The wagon jolted hard over stone, and pain tore across her lower back so sharply she bit her own tongue to keep from crying out. Hemp rope burned her wrists. Wet wool stank in her nose. A bitter herbal paste coated her gums where someone had forced it between her teeth, meant to keep a wolf docile and a pregnant captive compliant. She pushed her shoulder against rough plank and found iron rings bolted into the cart wall. They had prepared for resistance. Rain drummed overhead. Men laughed outside. Arabella dragged in air and tasted rust, old pine, horse sweat, and the sour trace of silverroot sedation. Memory arrived in flashes. Her room, dark and spinning. Old healer Maris pressing a cloth to her side where she had been cut during the attack. Elder Corvin telling her to rest while they secured her future. The heaviness that had slammed her under like black water. She had believed him. 3 nights earlier, Micah had died with his hand locked around hers, his blood hot on her skin, masked zealots chanting at the edge of the clearing while pack guards came too late, or not at all. She had not stopped hearing it. Even now, every wheel squeal became a blade scraping bone. Every shouted order became the roar of that night. She curled around her belly as much as the ropes allowed. The child shifted, small and steady, and that tiny movement almost undid her. Not now. Not while they can hear. The wagon flap snapped open. A lantern shoved in yellow light and revealed 2 men in oilskin cloaks. Neither wore Silvermane colors. One had a scar split through his eyebrow. The other chewed cloves and smiled without warmth. "Awake at last," Scarbrow said. "Good. Easier if you walk when we cross." She forced her voice through a dry throat. "Cross where?" "Blackgate Pass." Clovebreath leaned closer, gaze dropping to her stomach with the appraisal of a butcher judging weight. "After that, not our concern." Arabella stared at him until he shifted first. "Who bought me?" Scarbrow laughed. "You still think this is buying. Your elders called it debt settlement." He crouched and yanked her chin up. "Listen close, widow. Don't make this hard. They got coin, we got cargo, and you breathe as long as the buyer gets what he paid for." Cargo. The word landed colder than rainwater. When he released her, she turned her face to the plank, and kept it there, until the wagon flap dropped shut again. In darkness, her thoughts came ragged and bright. "I am not cargo. I am not done. Micah is gone, and I am still here. If I survive this road, our child survives. If I wait for mercy, we die politely, and everyone calls it law." By the 4th dawn since Micah's death, the caravan had climbed into the Blackgate switchbacks, where the air thinned and conifers bent under wind. Each turn sent needles of pain through the healing cut along her ribs. Her hands had gone numb, then burning, then numb again. She had tested the rope knot against the iron ring for hours, patient as hunger, until one strand began to fray on a splintered edge. Outside, voices drifted between thunder rolls. "Storm's turning mean." "Good, less patrol." "Nightshade wolves patrol all weather, fool." At that name, silence followed. Even traffickers feared Nightshade law. For 2 centuries, no debt caravan crossed their border unchallenged. Arabella had heard that as a child and filed it beside bedtime myths, too noble to be true. The wagon lurched. A wheel struck a rut deep enough to fling her sideways. The frayed strand snapped. Pain flared through her shoulders as she brought bound wrists under her knees and over her feet, scraping skin raw to free her legs. She swallowed a groan, pressed her forehead to wood, and waited for the next jolt. Rain hammered harder. Horses snorted and stamped. Men cursed at mud. This was the breaking point, not loud, but precise. Clove Breath climbed in with a flask and said almost casually, "Drink now. Buyer wants her quiet for the handover. Shepherd's men don't like loud females." Shepherd. The ash moon. Shepherd. The cult voice whispered through border camps. The fanatic who preached that marked bloodlines had to be ended before first cry. Arabella had dismissed it as fear-mongering from rival packs. Then masked zealots had butchered Micah. Then her own elders had sold her. Clove Breath pinched her jaw and tipped the flask. She twisted hard, slammed her shoulder into his chest, and drove both bound fists into his throat. He fell backward with a strangled sound, flask spilling into straw. She kicked once, caught his knee, and lunged through the open flap into cold rain and open air. The ground hit like stone. She rolled down embankment mud, branches whipping her face, then pushed up and ran. Each step jarred her healing wound. Breath burned. Water soaked her shift and weighted it to her thighs. Behind her, shouting erupted. "She's loose!" After her. She ran anyway, one hand on her belly, the other out for balance as she tore through fir shadows toward the narrow throat of the pass. Her wolf did not answer in full shift. Silverroot still blurred the edges of instinct. But awareness prickled sharp enough to map slope and loose rock and the nearest line of escape. Left, ravine. Right, cliff wall. Ahead, road again. She burst from tree cover into the mountain track just as riders rounded the bend below. 4 men, crossbows up. Arabella skidded, turned, and froze. A single rider stood at the pass mouth, horse black as soot, cloak dark as wet stone. Rain ran off him in narrow streams. He had no banner, no escort, and no need for either. The authority around him felt like winter pressing down a valley, absolute, indifferent, old. When he lifted his head, amber bled into his irises, molten and inhuman in the stormlight. The traders pulled hard on their reins. Scarbrow's voice cracked. "Move aside, debt transfer under council writ." The rider dismounted with unhurried precision and stepped between Arabella and the caravan. His scent reached her first, despite rain. Cedar, smoke, iron, and the clean, dangerous edge of alpha power so potent her knees nearly buckled. He angled his head toward her, nostrils flaring once. His gaze dropped to her bound wrists, then to the curve of her belly. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "State your sovereign permit," he said. Scarbrow held up a wax-sealed scroll with shaking fingers. "Silvermane sanction, legal sale, we are expected." The man did not take the scroll. "Slave transit is forbidden on Nightshade roads." "Not slave transit," Clove Breath panted, climbing from the wagon with mud on his face. "Debt collateral. She's a widow. No claimant." Arabella found her voice, hoarse and thin. "I am Arabella Silvermane. They took me from my bed without consent." The rider's eyes returned to hers, and for a heartbeat she saw not rage but recognition, as if he had been waiting for a scent he never expected to catch. "Release her," he said. Scarbrow made a bad choice and reached for his blade. What followed lasted less than a minute. The rider moved with brutal economy, every strike deliberate, no wasted motion. Steel rang once, twice. A crossbow clattered into mud. One trader fell hard and did not rise. 2 dropped weapons and tried to flee downslope. The 4th choked on rain and terror until Nightshade soldiers emerged from the trees, as if called by the storm itself, and pinned him face first to gravel. No spectacle, no cruelty. Judgment carried out on a road that had seen this crime too often. Arabella swayed where she stood. The rider turned back, rain tracing the hard lines of his face, and spoke as though announcing law to an assembly hall. "Alexander Nightshade," he said, "High Alpha of these lands, by sovereign right, I take this woman and her unborn child into Nightshade protection." His gaze cut to the surviving traitor held in the mud. "Carry this message to any who sent you. Whoever hunts this widow has declared war on my throne." The wind seemed to still around the words. Arabella's legs gave out at last. She expected stone. Instead, she felt one steady hand catch her elbow, careful of the bruises, as the Alpha King bent his head to hear the breath she could barely keep. "You are safe for this mile," he said quietly, the promise clipped, almost angry with its own tenderness. "Stay awake, Arabella." She tried. Darkness folded in anyway, and the last thing she sensed was cedar smoke, rain, and the iron certainty that her life had just split down the middle. Darkness did not stay kind. It thinned into fragments of sound and motion, hoofbeats striking wet stone, men speaking in low, disciplined bursts, leather creaking every time a horse shifted under load. Arabella surfaced just enough to feel cold rain on her face and a heavier weight across her shoulders, a cloak that smelled of cedar smoke and iron. She was moving, cradled against something unyielding and warm, and panic snapped through her before memory caught up. Blackgate. The road. The rider with molten eyes. She tried to jerk away and found an arm braced around her, not pinning, simply preventing her from falling. The same voice as before came from above her, level and spare. "If you fight now, you reopen your wound." Her throat scraped. "Where are you taking me?" "Home ground." A beat passed. "Not yours. Mine." The answer should have terrified her more than it did. She forced her eyes open. Storm clouds dragged low over the mountain spine, but the rain had slackened into mist, and the switchback road widened as it descended into a basin of black pines and stone outcrops carved by old water. Ahead, she glimpsed watchfires, spaced with military precision, each one enclosed in a ring of standing slate marked with silver runes that pulsed when riders passed. Nightshade wards. Not folklore, after all. By the time the last of the thunder had rolled east, they reached the first border post, a low fortress built straight into the cliff face. No drunken guards lounged by these gates. 6 wolves stood in formation under the arch, cloaks dark, hands near weapons, eyes tracking every movement with the rigid focus of soldiers who expected ambush as routine. Their gazes landed on Arabella's bound wrists, then snapped to the man holding her. No one asked his name. They dropped to one knee in the same breath. "Hi, Alpha," the captain said, fist to chest. Alexander Nightshade dismounted without jarring her, then set her on her feet long enough for the captain to cut the rope from her wrists. The fibers fell away in wet strands. Blood returned to her hands in painful waves, pins and needles turning quickly to fire. She swayed. Alexander caught her elbow again, his grip precise, never sliding where it did not need to. "Report," he said. "Pass secured. 2 couriers sent south and west with your war declaration. Surviving trafficker released at lower turn with marked writ, as ordered. He will carry your seal to storm-born routes before dawn." Arabella heard the words through fog and still understood their significance. He had not only saved her on a roadside impulse, he had moved pieces across territories within an hour, turning one interception into policy and threat. Power here was not loud. It was infrastructural. A woman in healer gray approached with a satchel and the calm gait of someone accustomed to pain. Her hair was braided tight against her skull, silver threaded through black. "I need to examine the cut along her ribs and check for sedative complications," she said. Arabella recoiled before she could stop herself. The motion was small, but everyone saw it. Alexander shifted half a step, placing his body between her and the gate torchlight without blocking her view. "Name," he said to the healer. "Vera." He looked at Arabella. "She does not touch you unless you agree." That simple permission struck harder than a shouted vow. Arabella swallowed, nodding once. Vera moved in slowly, hands visible, and lifted the torn edge of Arabella's shift just enough to assess the wound. Her fingers were cool, efficient, and unsentimental. Stitched recently, then reopened at least once, Vera murmured. Bruising around the abdomen, no immediate bleeding. Pup reflex delayed from Silverroot. But she is tracking. She needs warmth, broth, and rest before her body decides to fail on principle. Keep her conscious until the keep, Alexander said. No more sedatives. He led Arabella toward a second horse. She planted her feet. Fear rose, irrational and absolute, because every transfer now felt like another sale. I am not getting in another wagon, she said, voice breaking on the last word. There will be no wagon. His jaw tightened, as if with contained anger not directed at her. You ride with me or beside Captain Ilya. Your choice. Choice again. Small, but real. Arabella glanced at Captain Ilya, broad-shouldered and openly wary, then back at Alexander's unreadable face. Instinct chose danger she could name over fear she could not. With you, she whispered. He mounted first and hauled her up in front of him with controlled strength, one arm braced around her middle while he kept a careful gap from the healing cut. As they rode out, the Nightshade soldiers pivoted in silent formation and fell in behind like a closing gate. The road into his territory unwound through old forest, where trunks rose massive and close, roots gripping boulders like knuckled hands. Moonlight fought through torn clouds and slid over wardstones set at regular intervals along the track. Each stone held a carved spiral half filled with silver that brightened as Alexander passed, then dimmed in his wake. Arabella watched them with exhausted fascination. In Silvermane lands, protection had always depended on who favored whom. Here, the landscape itself obeyed a system. Present tense panic began to pound in her skull, relentless and intimate. I cannot sleep. If I sleep, I wake bound. If I close my eyes, I hear Micah choking and men chanting and Maris saying, "Rest like poison," in a gentle voice. This is another pack, another alpha, another set of laws written by mouths that can still lie. Keep your back straight. Count breaths. One for me, one for the child. Do not mistake discipline for mercy. Do not mistake mercy for safety. Yet his arm has not tightened once without warning, and when the horse slips, he takes the impact before it reaches my body. I do not know what that means. I do not know what anything means except this. Stay awake, stay breathing, survive until morning. Her head dipped anyway. When she surfaced next, the forest had opened to a high valley and the Nightshade Keep rose from it like part of the mountain itself. Basalt walls terraced with iron balconies, watchtowers crowned by blue-white fire that did not smoke. No decorative excess, no gilded bravado. Every line looked built for siege and winter. At the outer gate, more wolves waited, ranks deep, their silence sharper than shouting. News had outrun them. Alexander dismounted and reached up. Can you stand? Arabella tried. The ground tipped. Pain lanced from ribs to spine and her knees folded. He swore under his breath. Not at her, then lifted her before she hit stone. One arm slid beneath her knees, the other behind her shoulders. She tensed hard enough to shake. I can walk, she said through clenched teeth. You can collapse with dignity from a bed instead of a courtyard. The line was so dry, so unexpectedly human, that a strained laugh escaped her before she could crush it. Tension snapped, and then returned twice as fierce when he stepped toward the keep threshold. The arched entrance was inlaid with old runes, silver sunk into black rock, each mark quiet until Alexander crossed the first line. Then the entire frame lit at once. Heat slammed through his body into hers as if she had been pressed against a forge door. He halted so abruptly that the escort behind them stopped in confusion. For one suspended second, everything narrowed to contact. A low thrum built in Arabella's chest, not pain, not fear, something older and far more dangerous. Warmth raced along her veins in bright threads. Her pulse kicked hard. The child turned sharply under her hand. Beneath grief and exhaustion and numbed shock, raw recognition rose like a tide she had no defenses against, carrying two words she did not want and could not deny. Mine. Home. Alexander sucked in a breath as if struck. The rune scars along his forearms blazed gold through wet skin, light tracing old lines she had not noticed before, and hairline fractures crept across the stone slab under his boots with a brittle cracking sound. His pupils narrowed, then widened, predator and man warring in full view of his people. Amber flooded his irises until they looked lit from behind. Every wolf in the courtyard went still. He stared at her as though she were both miracle and threat. Arabella could not look away. The pull between them sharpened, a taut line hooked behind her ribs and anchored somewhere in his chest. It carried hunger without lust, terror without retreat, the overwhelming certainty of a bond that did not ask permission from mourning or politics or timing. Micah's face flashed in her mind, kind eyes gone dim in mud and torchlight. Guilt tore through her so violently she gasped. She should have felt only horror. Instead, she felt grief braided with an answering need that made no moral sense. No, Alexander said, and this time the word was to the night, to the moon above the battlements, to fate itself. He took 2 measured steps into the entry hall and set her down as though lowering sacred fire onto an altar, hands leaving her the instant she had balance. The moon had no right to ask this of either of us. His voice carried across stone, not loud but edged enough to cut. Arabella pressed her palm to the doorframe to stay upright. The runes beneath her fingers warmed in response, silver brightening to white before fading. A murmur moved through the gathered wolves like wind through dry leaves. Some looked astonished, some looked afraid. One older counselor near the stairs stared with open alarm at Arabella's belly, then at Alexander's burning scars. Alexander turned on him with a glance that ended whatever protest had been forming. "Summon inner guard only," he said, each word clipped. "No council tonight, no petitions, no audience." He looked back at Arabella. The feral brightness in his gaze had not receded, but his posture locked into hard restraint, every line controlled by force of will. "You will be given rooms on the east wing under my seal," he said. "No one enters without your consent except the healer you choose. If anyone pressures you, you tell me directly." Arabella managed, "Why?" The crux of the question hung between them, larger than law. Why save me? Why this fire under my skin? Why now, when she was still bleeding from another life? Alexander's mouth flattened, and for the first time uncertainty crossed his face, brief and unguarded. "Because the bond has spoken," he said, "and because I decide what my crown protects." Their eyes locked again, the same impossible recognition now fully named, and the keep seemed to hold its breath around them. And then Alexander moved first, turning his head toward Captain Ilya without taking his gaze from Arabella. "4 guards on the east corridor," he said. 2 outside, 2 at the stair. No one enters her rooms without her word or mine." Ilya struck fist to chest and peeled away, already issuing low commands. The gathered wolves scattered with disciplined speed, yet Arabella felt their attention linger like static along her skin. She stood in wet clothes under burning runes, wrists raw, body trembling, and every instinct told her that being watched had always meant being weighed for use. Alexander extended his hand, palm up, a formal offer rather than a grip. "You are still bleeding through the side stitching. Walk with me." She did not take his hand. He did not insist. He matched his stride to hers as they crossed the entry hall, his presence near enough to steady, distant enough to breathe. The east wing proved quieter than the main corridors, lit by wall braziers set low so the fire gave warmth without glare. At the 3rd door, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. The room beyond was not lavish, only deliberate. Thick blankets, A wide bed set away from draught, a table with a ceramic pitcher, a wash basin already steaming, shutters barred from inside, a second interior door likely for guard rotation. Safety engineered into architecture. Vera arrived moments later with clean linen and a tray of bitter-smelling salve. This time, Arabella nodded without prompting. While the healer worked, Alexander stood by the window with his back turned, rain still glistening on his shoulders. He asked no intimate questions, did not test the bond by scenting her neck, did not crowd her pain with reassurances he could not yet earn. When Vera tied off the new bandage and checked the child's heartbeat with careful hands and closed eyes, she gave a brief incline of her head. "Stable," Vera said. "Exhausted, but stable." Alexander replied, "Post someone she trusts outside the door." Vera glanced at Arabella. "There is no one she knows here." "Then post someone who understands silence." When they left, the room settled into a hush, broken only by rain ticking against shutters. Arabella sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her swollen hands. Skin split where rope had rubbed, faint crescents where her nails had cut her palms. Proof that she had fought. Proof that she had survived another handover by becoming the kind of woman who struck first and sorted grief later. Sleep took her in jagged drops, not rest so much as collapse. She dreamed torchlight and chanting and Micah falling again, always at the moment where she could not reach him. In the dream, she was running with her wrists bound, belly heavy, breath freezing in her lungs, and voices behind her repeated the same word until it stopped sounding like language. Cargo, cargo, cargo. She came awake with a strangled cry, scrambling backward until her spine hit the headboard. The room was dark except for embers in the brazier. Her bandage had shifted. Pain speared her ribs. The child rolled hard under her palm. For one disorienting heartbeat, she expected rope, wagon plank, men laughing outside. Instead, there was a knock. One soft strike. Then the door opened a hand's width. Alexander stood on the threshold, hair unbound, shirt changed, forearm runes dim beneath rolled sleeves. He looked less like a throne and more like a man who had not slept in years. He stayed where he was, hands visible at his sides. "You cried out," he said. Arabella swallowed air that would not fill her lungs. "Do not come closer." He knelt immediately, still beyond arm's reach, lowering himself until his eyes were below hers. The gesture disoriented her more than command would have. "You choose the distance," he said. 4 words. No argument, no wounded pride, no alpha edge demanding compliance. Her breathing remained ragged, but the terror changed shape, less a blade at her throat and more a fist unclenching by increments. "I saw them again," she whispered. "I smelled the masks. I heard Micah." Shame tightened her voice. "I could not stop it." Night terrors are not failure. He glanced toward the water pitcher, then back to her. "You have not eaten since the border post. Panic worsens when the body thinks it is dying." "I cannot keep food down." "Then broth." He rose only after she nodded, and when he returned 10 minutes later, he carried a small iron pot and a wooden cup. No servant followed. He set the pot on the brazier, crouched, and touched 2 fingers to the coal grate. Heat brightened from dull red to orange, then to white at the center. An alpha flame coaxed with precise control instead of spectacle. Steam lifted. Herbs and marrow softened the room with a domestic scent so ordinary it hurt. Arabella watched, bewildered. Kings did not kneel at midnight warming broth for women purchased and rescued in the same day. Men with power had always delegated gentleness to others so they could keep their hands clean. He poured, crossed halfway, and stopped. "Here?" She nodded again. He set the cup on a stool within her reach and retreated to his earlier spot near the door, leaving a clear line between them. She wrapped both hands around the wood and drank in small, careful swallows while he kept his gaze on the floorboards, granting privacy inside shared space. In her mind, thoughts came sharp and immediate, present tense and merciless. This is where he asks for gratitude. This is where he names a price. This is where mercy turns into debt, and debt turns into ownership with better manners. You know this pattern. You survived by learning it early. But he is looking away. He is waiting like my fear matters as much as his claim. He said the bond has spoken, and still he is acting as if my no carries weight. If this is strategy, it is patient enough to be frightening. If it is real, then every law I have lived under is smaller than I believed. Do not trust quickly. Do not mistake one decent night for safety. Yet my hands have stopped shaking, and my breathing follows the sound of his, and for the first time since Micah died, I am not alone with the dark. When the cup emptied, she set it down and found him watching her now, expression controlled but softer at the edges. "Thank you," she said, the words unfamiliar in her own mouth. He inclined his head once. "Sleep if you can. I will sit outside until dawn. If panic returns, knock twice on the wall. I will answer." "You do not have council business?" His mouth turned, almost a smile, gone in a blink. "Council can wait one night." He left without touching her. The door closed, not latched, and she heard his footfalls take position beyond it. No pacing, no restless weight of a predator denied. Just a steady presence, like a shield set against the threshold. By first light, the storm had moved east and left the valley washed clean, every stone sharp with mourning. Vera changed Arabella's dressing after sunrise and brought news in practical fragments while tightening linen. Traitors at Blackgate had been identified and their route maps seized. 2 outer sentries wounded in the fire diversion drills from last month had recovered. The released trafficker had reached storm-born ground with Nightshade's declaration before dawn, exactly as intended. No loose ends, only consequences. Near midday, a guard named Tamsin escorted Arabella to the upper council chamber at Alexander's order. The hall was a semicircle of dark cedar benches descending toward a central floor marked with old pack sigils burned into stone. Sunlight entered through narrow, high windows and cut bright bars across faces that had learned to hide reactions for a living. Elder wolves, military captains, ward keepers, trade stewards, governance with teeth. Arabella remained standing near the rear wall, one hand braced against her lower back. Conversation thinned as eyes tracked to her belly and then away, some embarrassed, some appraising, one or two openly hostile. Alexander entered last, cloak removed, crown absent, authority unchanged. He took the central position and spoke without preamble. "Arabella Silvermane remains under my protection by sovereign law. Any petition regarding her status is heard now, in her presence." Silence stretched, then snapped when a broad-shouldered counselor in wolf gray rose from the second bench. His name reached her a beat later from whispered side talk. Garrick Vale, border veteran, voice of hardline traditionalists. "With respect to the crown," Garrick said, and there was little respect in the tone. "The woman carries prophecy blood in an unstable political season. We cannot pretend this is a private compassion matter. For pack safety, she should be confined to lower sanctum quarters until birth. Restricted contact, controlled movement, no access to ward systems." He looked directly at Arabella when he said confined, as if offering medicine she was too weak to choose herself. Another elder, narrow-faced and careful, added, "No insult intended. This is precedent. Prophecy wombs draw factions, and factions ignite civil fracture." Prophecy womb. The phrase struck like a slap wrapped in ceremony. Arabella held herself still while old humiliation burned through her chest. In Silvermane she had been widow, then debt asset. Here she was, vessel. Different hall, same erasure, polished into policy language. Alexander did not raise his voice. "You are speaking about her as if she is not in this room." Garrick spread his hands. "I am speaking about risk. Your bond event at the threshold was witnessed by half the keep. Our enemies will move faster now. If she is taken, your authority fractures with her. Confinement is strategic, not punitive. A primary rule of wolf politics was never to expose vulnerability publicly unless you were prepared to kill for what followed. Alexander stepped down from the central mark and stopped before Arabella. Then, in full view of the chamber, he tilted his head and bared his throat to her. The room went dead silent. Dominant surrender. Not theatrical. Not symbolic fluff for sentimental factions. A living alpha offering his most vulnerable point before rivals and subordinates alike, declaring trust through embodied risk. No king offered that lightly because it rewrote hierarchy in a single motion. Arabella felt every stare land on her. She did not move for a heartbeat, then lifted her hand and rested 2 fingers near the pulse at his neck, not gripping, only acknowledging the gift. Heat pulsed under her fingertips, steady and strong. Alexander straightened and faced the council, his expression now carved from winter. "Any wolf who questions her dignity questions my crown," he said. "Any wolf who speaks of confining her without her consent will answer to me directly. Garrick Vale, you will transfer to the northern border outpost by sundown. Exile duty, 60 days. You asked for strategy. Here is mine. We do not become the tyrants our enemies preach us to be." Garrick went rigid. "You would sideline a veteran over one dispute? I would remove anyone who mistakes fear for governance." No one challenged him. The narrow-faced elder lowered his gaze first. Others followed, some in reluctant acceptance, some in quiet relief. Tamsin beside Arabella released a breath she had been holding. Alexander turned slightly, enough that only Arabella heard his next words. "If you want to leave this chamber, say it and we leave." She searched his face for manipulation and found none, only controlled fury on her behalf and an odd, grave patience that made room for her will inside his power. The realization landed slowly, then all at once. He was not protecting his claim by reducing her. He was protecting her person even when it complicated his rule. "I will stay," she said. He nodded once, as if her answer mattered to statecraft, and resumed the session with brisk directives. Additional ward rotations, escort revisions for festival week, investigation into forged correspondence tied to Ash Moon cells. Every order threaded back to one principle he had just made public. No life in Nightshade territory could be traded, hidden, or managed as property. When the chamber emptied, Arabella remained by the cedar wall for a moment, hand on her belly, listening to her own pulse settle. Tamsin offered her arm for the walk back, and this time Arabella accepted, without flinching. At the corridor turn, she glanced toward the central dais where Alexander stood speaking quietly with Elia. He looked up as if he had felt her gaze. No smile, no possessive summons, just a small incline of his head, asking rather than taking. Arabella returned the nod. It was not trust yet, but it was the first deliberate lowering of her guard, and both of them understood exactly what it cost. Arabella returned the nod, then let Tamsin guide her down the east corridor with the careful pace her ribs demanded. She had reached her door when boots struck stone behind them in a clipped, urgent rhythm. Captain Ilya came into view with rain on his cloak and a sealed leather tube in his hand, black wax stamped with the broken circle mark from Blackgate. "For the High Alpha and Lady Arabella," he said, breathing hard but controlled. "Immediate." Alexander was there a breath later, as if command could bend distance. He broke the seal, scanned the first page, and the stillness in his face turned dangerous. "Inside," he said. Her room became a war chamber in minutes. Vera arrived. Tamsin barred the corridor. Ilya unrolled maps across the table while Alexander handed Arabella the second sheet without commentary. The writing was rough and hurried, copied from testimony taken from one of the captured caravan guards before transfer. "The Ash Moon Shepherd has a true name, Drake Stormborn, former war captain under Stormborn banners. Presumed dead 7 winters ago after the Ridge Purge. Not dead. rebuilt as cult preacher across debt roads and exile camps. Arabella read the line twice, then a third time as memory shifted into place. She had heard the name Drake once in Silvermane Council disputes years ago, spoken with equal parts respect and disgust, the soldier who had denounced hereditary rule and vanished after accusing 3 alphas of trafficking under ritual cover. The next page held his doctrine in fragments taken from seized pamphlets. Prophecy blood becomes throne rot. Break the chain before first cry. No kings chosen by moonblood. He is not a fanatic wandering with a torch, Alexander said. He is strategic. He recruits from wolves already brutalized by debt roots, then gives them a theology that turns pain into permission. Ilya tapped the map where trade roads converged on Nightshade borders. He never attacks strongholds directly at first. He poisons legitimacy, makes people believe their rulers are breeding dynasties, not governing packs. Vera slid a cloth pouch onto the table, found on a courier taken near the southern ford. Powdered silver root blended with valerian bark and poppy ash. Same balance as what was forced on her. She looked to Arabella. Whoever prepared your dose had healer knowledge. The word healer left a metallic taste in Arabella's mouth. Maris pressing cloth to her side. Maris telling her to rest. Maris standing near her bed on the last night in Silvermane, eyes soft, voice kind, hands steady. She pressed fingers into the table edge until her knuckles whitened. Maris. Alexander's gaze snapped to her. Your healer. She knew exactly how much sedative to give me without stopping my pulse. She knew when guard shifts changed. She knew which elders had debt ties. Arabella looked at Vera. If Drake built this network through exile camps, he would prize midwives and healers. They move through locked doors with no questions. Ilya swore under his breath. We have 3 temporary birth attendants in lower wards for festival influx. Lock down all healer credentials, Alexander said. Re-verify every transfer document, every sanctuary claim, every temple pass. He reached for another page and handed it to Arabella. This one was cleaner, carefully forged, bearing Micah's name in a hand that mimicked old Silvermane record scripts. The text claimed Micah had pledged to Ash Moon cells before his death, and that Arabella carried a marked heir intended for correction. The intent was surgical. Not just character murder. Isolation. They're spreading these in market squares, Ilya said. If people believe her first mate stood with Drake, some will treat her as willing participant instead of target. Arabella's breath shortened. Grief came back with teeth, sharper because it wore counterfeit ink. Micah had been stubborn, gentle, infuriatingly hopeful in politics, and absolutely devoted to protecting civilians during border raids. Seeing his name twisted into cult propaganda felt like watching someone desecrate a grave while asking for applause. Alexander did not touch her. He placed both palms on the table and spoke to the room. Official response goes out now. Micah Silvermane died resisting zealot violence. Anyone circulating falsified affiliation records is charged with sedition and incitement under Nightshade law. His eyes shifted to Ilya. Courier copies to every allied pack before sunset. That external line was answered faster than Arabella expected. By late evening, 3 ravens returned with coded tags. Riverglass acknowledged receipt and pledged archive verification support. Thornvale sent names of known Ash Moon recruiters moving north in 2s and 3s. Silvermane's response arrived last, brief and evasive. No evidence of elder complicity. Internal matters remain internal. Alexander read that one in silence, then folded it once with mathematical precision. Noted, he said, and handed it to Ilya for record. If they refuse cleanup, we proceed without them. By the second night after council, Nightshade Keep looked calm from the terraces and felt like a drawn bow from inside. Patrols doubled. Scent wards were refreshed every 4 hours. Temple doors were logged by name. None of it slowed the whisper campaign. Arabella could feel it in the pauses when she entered common halls, in the way conversations thinned around her before resuming in altered pitch. Pressure gathered from every side, cult pamphlets in lower wards, conservative council eyes measuring risk, and the bond itself, relentless and unasked. Attraction did not arrive as softness. It arrived as awareness so acute it became a liability. She could track Alexander across corridors by heat, by scent, by the subtle shift in her own breathing when he stepped close. He kept distance when he could, but strategy kept forcing them into the same rooms. On the third morning, he brought her to the ward archive beneath the old chapel, where stone shelves held tablets etched with moon commands older than either bloodline. The chamber smelled of wax, dust, and cold metal. He stood opposite her at a broad slate table while ward keeper Soren explained eclipse dynamics in clipped technical terms. If Ash Moon plans symbolic action, Soren said, tapping a carved diagram, they will strike when ceremony focus splits our resources. Public rights above, guard rotation stretched, civilians concentrated. Arabella leaned over the diagram despite the ache in her back. These outer lattice points, she said. Why are they dormant? Tradition, Soren replied. Pregnant wolves were barred from the moon circle after the famine era. They feared overload. Or they feared women they could not control, she said, before she could soften it. Soren blinked, then chose diplomacy. Possibly both. Alexander's mouth moved at one corner, not amusement exactly, more recognition of an argument he had expected from her and respected for that reason. Their fingers brushed over the same rune marker as they reached for it. The contact was brief, accidental, and devastating in its precision. Heat raced up Arabella's wrist. Alexander went very still. She withdrew first, heart unsteady. Inside her, thought sharpened into present tense again, intimate and unsparing. I am drawn to him and angry about it. I am mourning and alive and tired of those truths being treated as contradiction. If I step toward this bond, I betray memory. If I reject it, I betray the woman who fought through rope and rain to stay breathing. He is not asking me to forget. He is asking me to choose in real time, with danger at the door and no clean script. I am afraid of wanting what feels like shelter because shelter has always had terms hidden in small print. Yet every day he gives me terms in plain language, and every day I test them, and every day they hold. I do not know if that is love. I know it is changing the geometry of fear. Alexander broke the silence without looking up. You do not need to carry this campaign and your grief and my politics at once. Arabella surprised herself with a rough half-laugh. Then stop giving me all three in the same room. His gaze lifted, amber deepening with something almost warm. I am trying. That night, pressure turned kinetic. Ilya intercepted two women in healer gray using forged inner ward passes, each carrying sedatives hidden inside prayer candles. Under questioning, one admitted they had been told to guide the prophecy widow to river tunnels if smoke alarms sounded. The order came from a contact called Shepherd's Hand, delivered through a midwife dismissed from Stormborn service. Maris had crossed the border. Alexander issued immediate changes. No evacuation movement for Arabella without his direct signet, no healer access unverified by Vera, and counterintelligence teams planted inside festival prep crews. The response should have reassured her. Instead, it clarified the crux. Drake was no rumor now. He had people inside reach, doctrine on the walls, and a timetable tied to the Eclipse Festival only one day away. By dusk of the festival eve, wind drove smoke from kitchen chimneys low across the lower wards, and bells began tolling for ceremonial assembly. Lantern lines swung over courtyards crowded with civilians carrying offerings. Drums rolled from the temple terrace. Too many bodies, too many blind corners. Arabella stood in an antechamber off the east stair, fastening a plain dark cloak over her dress, while Tamsin checked corridor positions. Vera had just finished a final exam and left her with strict instructions to report any tightening across her abdomen. Not panic and not overexertion, Vera had said. "Tell me early, not late." From the terrace below came a sudden shout, then another, sharper. Ilya's voice echoed from the stairwell. "Fire in the lower granary line, Sector 3 and 4, move now." The first smoke plume hit seconds later, black and thick, rising fast enough to blot half the courtyard torches. Bells changed pattern from ceremonial cadence to emergency strike. Crowd noise shifted from festive murmur to jagged fear. 2 women in temple wraps appeared at the antechamber door, faces veiled against smoke. "Lady Arabella," one said, bowing quickly. "Captain's order. We move you through service passage to river shelter." Tamsin's hand went to her blade. "Signet." The woman produced a token in gloved fingers. It carried nightshade engraving, but the wax inset was wrong shade, too matte, recently poured. Arabella's skin went cold. Beneath incense and smoke, she caught a familiar note. Clove and bitter root. The same blend from the wagon, the same blend Maris used in Silvermane. She met Tamsin's eyes. "They are not ours." Everything happened at once. Tamsin lunged. One imposter flung powder into the air. White grit burst and hissed where it struck brazier flame. Guards shouted from the corridor. The second woman ran for the stair, ripping her veil aside as she moved. Not Maris. Younger. Fanatical focus in her face. "By Ashen Moon," she screamed, voice carrying over bells, "break the blood chain." A blast sounded from below, not an explosion of fire but a wardstone rupture, deep and resonant. The floor trembled. Through the high window, Arabella saw silver lines on the outer gate flicker, then fail in one entire quadrant. Glamour shadows peeled off 2 men near the courtyard fountain, revealing cult marks painted across their throats. Critical. Not a probing attack. Full strike. Ilya appeared in the doorway with soot on his cheek and 4 guards at his back. "They hit the ward lattice and granaries together. We have civilians trapped in tunnel approaches." Another tremor rolled through stone. Arabella braced against the wall as a hard tightening crossed her abdomen and released, then returned a minute later, stronger. Vera's warning flashed through her mind. "Tell me early." She looked past Ilya toward the temple rise where the sacred moon circle stood above the keep like a waiting blade. If the lattice had failed at one quadrant, someone had keyed a reversal from inside. Soldiers could hold corridors, but only the circle could rethread all outer wards at once. "Ilya," she said, voice steady despite the pressure building under her ribs, "get me to the moon circle. Now." He stared at her, horrified comprehension dawning as another bell cracked the air and smoke swallowed the lower stair. "My lady, the circle is the primary target." "Yes," Arabella said, already moving toward the door. "Which is why we take it before Drake does." The crux was brutally simple. If Arabella let herself be moved like protected cargo, Drake would own the night. If she stepped into the one place tradition forbade her to stand, she might keep the keep alive long enough for everyone else to survive it. Smoke pushed down the corridor in greasy folds, turning torchlight the color of bruised amber. Ilya swore once, then snapped into motion, signaling 2 guards ahead and 2 behind, while Tamsin stayed locked at Arabella's shoulder, blade drawn. They hit the stair at a near run. Bells hammered from every tower, out of rhythm now because one of the north peals had gone dead. Halfway up, a body slid down the steps toward them, a nightshade sentry coughing soot, eyes streaming. Tamsin hauled him aside and shoved him toward the medics climbing from below. The air tasted of burned grain and wet stone. Somewhere in the lower wards, civilians screamed names into smoke. At the terrace landing, the full scope of the attack came into view. Fire licked along the granary eaves in 3 separate lines, too cleanly spaced to be accidental. Ward stones around the courtyard flickered in broken sequence, silver to black, like a pulse failing under a healer's hand. Glamored infiltrators were no longer hidden. Arabella saw painted ash spirals on throats and wrists as Nightshade archers forced them back from the temple steps. Two cultists dragged a cask toward the ward pedestal, trying to shatter it outright. Ilya barked an order, and arrows thudded into wood, tipping the cask before it reached the stone. Then the shepherd's voice cut across everything, amplified by ritual cadence and fanatic certainty. "Bring me the widow and the chain breaks tonight." Drake Stormborn stood at the edge of the moon circle in a cloak the color of old bone, rain stippling ash across his sleeves. He was broader than Arabella had imagined, war-forged and scarred, with the stillness of a commander who expected to be obeyed even while under fire. Around his left forearm coiled a chain dusted white, links etched in tiny eclipse runes that hurt to look at directly. Maris stood 3 paces behind him in healer gray, hood thrown back, face stripped of all softness. The betrayal landed cleanly now, no room left for doubt. Maris saw Arabella and lifted her chin as if greeting a patient. "You were always meant for this circle," she called. "I only remove the lies around you." Tamsin lunged forward, but Drake snapped the chain once and a crescent of ashlight cracked against the stair rail, splitting stone. Guards scattered to avoid the strike. One stumbled and would have gone over the edge if Ilya had not caught him by the collar. "Hold defensive ring!" Ilya roared. "No one engages the chain head-on." Another contraction seized Arabella low and hard, forcing her hand to the wall until it passed. Vera's warning echoed with clinical clarity. Early, not late. Pain was information, not defeat. She drew one careful breath, then looked from the failing ward stones to the civilians trapped near the lower tunnel mouth, pressed together and coughing under drifting smoke. They were boxed by panic and blocked by a collapsed beam. She turned to Ilya. "Get those families to the inner crypt routes. Use the chapel descent, not the West Hall. West Hall will be trapped." His stare flicked to her abdomen, then to Drake's chain. "And you?" "I open the lattice. My orders are to keep you alive. Then obey the part where I stay alive by ending this." The argument lasted a single heartbeat. Ilya chose. He pointed at 2 runners. "Clear chapel descent now. Tamsin, with me for civilian corridor. 2 guards remain with Lady Arabella." He leaned closer, voice rough with urgency. "If he reaches you, fall back to the altar spine. It disrupts chain geometry." Arabella nodded and broke from cover toward the circle stairs as rain began again, sudden and cold. The sacred moon circle was older than the keep, a ring of standing stones around a low altar of veined basalt. Tradition had wrapped it in reverence and fear for generations, and pregnant wolves were barred from crossing its threshold. Tonight, prohibition felt like another kind of weapon, one Drake expected her to obey. She stepped over the carved boundary line anyway, boots sliding on wet lichen, and the nearest stone woke under her feet with a dim silver hum. Maris cried out, startled despite herself. "She cannot key it." Her line was dormant. Arabella answered without looking back. "Dormant is not dead." She climbed the altar steps, grabbed the ceremonial blade from its hook, and cut her palm in one swift draw. Blood welled bright against the rain. She pressed her hand to the central sigil and spoke the oldest Silvermane command she knew, a phrase her grandmother had taught her as history, never as instruction. "By line carried, by life carried, ward to witness." At first, nothing. Then the sigil drank her blood and flared. Silver light shot from the altar to the nearest standing stone, then to the next, racing the ring in jagged arcs. The outer ward stones across the keep answered with rising tones, one by one, as if a buried instrument had found its key again. Gates boomed shut. Iron bars slammed into place over the south breach. Glamours peeled off infiltrators in streaks of black vapor, exposing faces and cult marks to every archer on the wall. In the lower courtyard, trapped civilians saw the crypt route lanterns ignite blue and began moving in a directed line under Ilya's shouted commands. The strain hit Arabella immediately. It felt like holding open a floodgate with bare hands while the river climbed. Heat pulsed beneath her skin. Her vision narrowed at the edges. She dropped to one knee and kept her bleeding palm on the sigil, forcing the current to stabilize. Another contraction rolled through her, longer this time, and she bit down on a cry. Rain turned to silver threads in the ward glow. For one suspended moment she sensed every active node in the keep, every breach point trying to reopen, every line she had to keep closed. This was what her bloodline had hidden, and why people like Drake feared it. Not destiny as tyranny, infrastructure as protection. Minutes later, Ilya's voice rang from below, hoarse but triumphant. Civilians clear on the chapel side, inner crypt doors sealed. Arabella risked a glance and saw children clutched against parents, elders supported under both arms, disappearing into torchlit stone, while nightshade guards formed a shield wall at the tunnel mouth. No one abandoned. No one traded. Drake moved then, abandoning his distance. He mounted the circle steps with chain in both hands, chanting under his breath. Runes along the links ignited with Eclipse's dark fire and lashed toward her in a looping arc. The two guards assigned to her stepped in. One took the strike on his bracer and spun away, arm numb, while the other drove Drake back half a pace with a spear haft to the ribs. Maris hurled a pouch at the altar, and silver root dust exploded in a bitter cloud. Arabella coughed, eyes watering, but did not lift her palm from the sigil. Drake's voice sharpened as he advanced again. You feel it, widow. The cage tightening. Your child becomes his throne, and your grief becomes state ceremony. You murdered my mate to preach freedom, Arabella said, each word dragged through pain. Do not speak to me about cages. He swung the chain low, hooked her ankle, and yanked. She hit the altar edge hard enough to see white. The ward line flickered across 3 towers. Shouts erupted from the courtyard as a side gate trembled. Arabella? Ilya started up the steps, blocked by 2 cultists who broke from cover with short blades. Drake planted a boot on the altar step and raised the chain over her. Severance by Ash and Moon, witness and release. A roar answered him from the stair mouth, deep enough to shake breath from lungs. Alexander hit the circle in partial shift, claws extended, canines bared, amber blazing through rain. He collided with Drake mid-chant and drove him into the standing stones with a crack of bone against rock. The chain whipped loose and snapped sparks where it struck the altar rim. Pack wolves surged behind their king, locking down the steps while Ilya's team finished the last infiltrators near the chapel rail. Drake fought like the war captain he had been, ruthless and efficient even against superior force. He drove an elbow into Alexander's throat, rolled under a claw strike, and kicked for the king's wounded side. Alexander took the hit, staggered, then came back harder, one hand fisted in Drake's cloak, the other raking across chain arm to break his leverage. They crashed through rain and ward light between 2 standing stones, predator speed against ritual precision. Arabella dragged herself upright, blood slick on her palm, and re-anchored the sigil before the lattice failed. The chain lay half across the altar, still glowing. She saw Drake glance at it, saw the calculation. Bind the king's throat, break the bond in public, make doctrine into spectacle. He lunged for it. So did she. Her fingers closed on the links first. Agony shot up her arm as ash runes tried to bite into her skin, but she wrapped the chain around Drake's wrist in a hard, twisting loop and slammed his own forearm against the altar mark. His eyes widened as recognition hit too late. Blood oath carries judgment, she said, voice raw and ringing over the storm. Name the Oathkeeper. Drake snarled and tried to wrench free. I answer to no crown. You answer to what you swore. She spoke the ward command in full, the one Soren had translated from the famine tablets, and she had memorized that morning in case this exact geometry ever became necessary. By witness stone and living line, oath turns inward. Let maker face making. The chain runes inverted from black to white. Light surged up Drake's arm and locked him to the altar as if iron had grown through stone. Moonfire rose around him in a column of pale flame, consuming the cult marks painted and branded across his skin. He screamed once, fury more than pain, and spat blood-tinged rain at her feet. "Prophecy is a cage," he rasped. Arabella held his gaze, palm still bleeding into the sigil that kept the keep sealed. "No, your fear is." Alexander stepped in beside her, chest heaving, claws still out, face splattered with rain and ash. He met Arabella's eyes for a single consent-seeking beat, then turned to Drake. "For the dead at Blackgate, for every souled child, for this pack." His strike was swift and final, claws driving through Drake's chest. The shepherd went rigid, then slack, pinned to the altar by his own chain as the moonfire guttered and died. Silence hit the circle in a heavy wave, broken only by rain and distant crackle from the contained granary fires. Below, nightshade wolves began disarming the remaining cultists. Maris dropped to her knees, hands raised, face gray with the collapse of borrowed certainty. Ilya bound her wrists in plain view of the gathered pack and read the charges loud enough for the terraces to hear. Treason, conspiracy to abduct, attempted ritual killing, collusion in debt trafficking. Arabella's arm shook violently now. The lattice had stabilized, but releasing it too fast could reopen the south breach. Alexander slid an arm behind her back without forcing her weight, anchoring rather than taking over. "Easy," he said, voice lowered to her alone. 3 breaths, then release. She followed him. 1 breath for herself. 1 for the child. 1 for the keep that had chosen tonight, not to become what it fought. Then she lifted her palm from the sigil. The ward light settled from blinding silver to steady moon glow, secure and whole. Only then did her knees buckle. Alexander caught her, and this time she did not fight the hold. Rain softened to a fine mist as he carried her down from the altar to the lee of the standing stones, where the wind could not hit her full force. The courtyard below was controlled now, commands crisp instead of frantic. Cultists bound in lines, medics moving between wounded guards with litters and blankets. Smoke thinned above the granaries. The keep was still scarred, still shaking, but alive. Arabella's body trembled with the aftershock of power and pain. Another contraction gripped low, then eased. Vera reached them at a run, checked pulse, checked pupils, pressed careful fingers to Arabella's wrist and belly. "Not crowning," Vera said, breathless with relief. "Stress contractions. She needs warmth and steady breathing. Do not move her far yet." Alexander nodded and lowered himself beside Arabella on the wet stone, 1 knee down, 1 boot planted, close enough to shield her from wind. Blood and rain striped his throat. Drake's ash had smeared across his jaw. His claws had receded, but the predator still looked out through his eyes. The gathered wolves on the terrace had gone quiet again, watching. Arabella felt the bond between them as a taut current, unfinished and insistent. It pulsed with relief, fury, grief, hunger for closeness, and the raw certainty that they had crossed a line no ritual could undo. He looked at her, as if asking a question that mattered more than his crown. "Arabella," he said, voice roughened by battle and restraint, "I will not take this from you in shock or blood loss. If you want distance, I give it. If you want time, I give it. If you choose me now, I mark only with your consent." The words settled into her like warmth after winter. No coercion hidden in ceremony, no debt disguised as protection. Choice, again, when she was at her most vulnerable. She lifted her hand to the back of his neck and drew him closer. "I choose," she whispered. "Here, witnessed. No shadows." His eyes closed for 1 breath, reverent and wrecked. "Say it once more." "I choose you, Alexander. Mine if you still want it." A broken sound escaped him, not weakness, more like relief cracking old armor. Yours, he said. Always. He shifted, giving her every chance to turn away, then bent his head to the junction of her shoulder and throat. His teeth pierced skin in one deliberate bite, sharp pain blooming first, clean and hot. Arabella inhaled hard and felt the sensation change almost at once, pain opening into a rush of heat that spread through her chest and down her spine in bright waves. The world narrowed to pulse and breath, and the rhythm of his hold around her, steady as a vow. Light flared at the edge of her vision. Gold from him, silver from her. Threads braided between them, visible even in dawn haze, spiraling from his sternum to hers as if the bond had always existed and only needed permission to ignite. He released the bite and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing hard. Mine, he murmured, the word half prayer, half promise. Mate. Arabella touched the mark on her neck, wet with rain and blood, then slid her palm to his throat where she had once laid 2 fingers before the council. His pulse struck strong beneath her hand. He bared that vulnerable line to her again without hesitation. Hold still, she said, and he did. She bared her own teeth and bit over his pulse, not deep enough to harm, deep enough to claim. His breath hitched. His hands tightened at her waist, then steadied, letting her set the depth and release. A second surge moved through the bond, fiercer than the first, and she felt him from the inside out. The iron discipline, the loneliness carved by duty, the rage he carried like a weapon, and beneath all of it a devotion so absolute it frightened him. Yours, she said against his skin. Mate. The words completed the circuit. The pressure that had ridden her ribs for days settled into a low, constant hum, no longer jagged. His presence in her mind was not an invasion, more like a door opened and left unlocked. He felt her grief for Micah and did not flinch from it. She felt his fear of failing those he protected and did not turn away. Around them, several wolves dropped to one knee. Others followed, not to him alone, but to both of them. Alexander drew back just enough to look at her. The feral edge in his gaze had softened into something fierce and tender. He touched her cheek with blood-stained knuckles, careful as if she were breakable, and clearly knowing she was not. No more sold daughters, he whispered. Arabella answered from the same breath. No more unloved kings. He laughed once, ragged and astonished, then gathered her into his arms and held her while dawnlight edged the stones. For the first time since the wagon, since rope and rain and betrayal, her body understood safety as more than strategy. 3 days later, the great hall smelled of sealing wax, hot iron, and cedar ink as evidence was laid out on long trestle tables under guard. Ilya placed each item with spoken chain of custody, the seized trader route maps from Blackgate, the leather tube reports, the forged letters defaming Micah, the prayer candles packed with sedatives, the false signet token, Maris's coded ledger, and Drake's bone ash chain now inert inside a warded iron coffer. Soren testified that the chain runes had been fully neutralized and archived as prohibited ritual contraband. Nothing vanished into rumor. Nothing was handled privately. Riverglass archivists arrived before noon and publicly verified the forged scripts against original Silvermane records. Thornvale's recruiter names matched captured infiltrators in Nightshade cells, closing that thread. Silvermane's evasive reply was entered into the ledger exactly as received. By evening, Garrick Vale sent word from the northern outposts that Elder Corvin had attempted to cross under false papers and was detained with 2 council aides tied to debt accounts. Garrick requested no praise and offered no excuses, only names and dates. Arabella read the report twice, then signed the warrant transfer with a steady hand. Maris stood trial at sunset. She did not weep, did not beg, and finally admitted she had dosed Arabella for payment and ideology both. I thought bloodlines should end, she said. I told myself harm now prevents harm later. The hall rejected the logic in silence colder than shouting. She was sentenced to life labor in the border infirmaries under oathbind, healing those displaced by the roots she had fed. When the judgments closed, Alexander convened the Allied delegates in the Moon Court. Arabella stood beside him wearing plain black and silver, mark visible at her throat, hand resting over the curve of her belly. She did not wait to be invited to speak. "The Nightshade Accord," she said, voice carrying across stone, "outlaws debt sale of wolves and dependents across all signatory territories, criminalizes bloodline purge doctrine, and establishes sanctuary rights for widows, pups, and displaced mates. Any pack that traffics lives forfeits trade privileges and ward access." One by one, seals struck wax, Riverglass first, Thornvale next. 2 mountain clans after that. By the time moonrise silvered the courtyard, the accord had become law in more territory than Drake had ever controlled with fear. Alexander then announced council reform. No single faction controlling adjudication, rotating civilian seats, independent archive audits every winter. The older counselor, who had once stared at Arabella's pregnancy with alarm, stepped forward, bowed deeply, and requested assignment under Soren to repair the breached ward quadrant he had failed to trust her to touch. Arabella accepted. Some looks never got speeches. They got work. Under that same moon, with pack banners lowered in vow rather than fear, she was invested as High Luna Regent and Keeper of the Moon Wards. Alexander placed a circlet of dark silver on her head, then knelt first before she could kneel to him, and the court answered with raised fists to heart. Months later, on a protected full moon in the East Wing birthing chamber, Vera guided Arabella through the final hard hours while Tamsin held cool cloth to her neck, and Elia guarded the door like a carved pillar who occasionally muttered practical encouragement at the wall. The child arrived just before midnight, loud and furious and perfect, placed against Arabella's chest while Alexander bent over both of them with tears he did not hide. Their bonded marriage rite followed at first dawn in the inner garden, intimate and solemn. No spectacle, no fear. Just vows spoken clearly, marks touched, hands joined over their sleeping child as witnesses formed a quiet ring around them. Home, Arabella learned, was not the place that claimed ownership first. Home was the place that guarded your dignity when it would have been easier not to. In nightshade stone and moonlight, with her mate at her side and her child in her arms, she was no one's cargo. She was claimed, crowned, and finally home.